At your table, I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nikos RPG Game Master's Soapbox. Tonight we are going to be covering the, I guess you'd call it the deep dark secret. It's the undisclosed reality of what it is to make a game out of roleplay. And before we get started with that, we need to make sure you hit all the buttons down below to let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience, and let's sally forth.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so tonight we're going to be talking about roleplay and the role-playing game mechanisms and where the game comes into it and how a game plays out play by play. I'm going to basically be going over a presentation of a specific scenario, and then I will talk about how the die rolling involved is resolved so that we can see how the actions progress. For those of you that are not familiar with roleplay, the concept is really no different than when we were children and went outside to play and picked an arbitrary topical head or a theme and then chose archetypical roles within that theme and then played out those characters' actions in the real time of the gameplay. And with kids and playing outside, there's not a rule system. There's no yes, no, no, right, wrong. And in the role-playing games, it's also fundamentally similar, except that the role-play game master generally is the adjudicator of the outcomes and explains what has happened each round through the resolution of the scene. So now we've talked before about the concept of the God rule that the GM is always right, and the only reason why I mentioned it here is in the particulars of a scene, the game master simply is the one who determines the action and the resolution so that the story can move on from scene to scene. So we're going to talk first about the Nikos RPG in particular, and we're going to talk about the concept of dice protocols. Pardon me. When you are in a role-playing game, you generally have a mechanism for determining the success failure of any given action, and you attribute a numeric value to the success or failure of that action, roll the dice against that, and with that resolution, have a conclusion. Generally, it's a success or a failure. Now, in the case of Nikos RPG, each die roll is considered to be somewhat of a quantum die rolling mechanism because you have a whole panoply of possible outcomes that the die roll might represent. So looking at it from a percentage standpoint, a perfect roll would be to roll 1 out of 100. Significantly difficult to do. And even though it's not as realistically rare as a miracle, nonetheless it kind of feels like one to actually achieve the success of rolling that perfect die roll. Additionally, when we look at the die rolls, we're going to be looking at it in terms of various levels of success and then failure. And the levels of success go from absolutely crazy, wild, and unexpectedly positive success down to normal successes and then finally to partial successes. Now, in the case of these, we in the world of Nikos refer to them as DD or double down success, which is a wild success, provided a better benefit than a standard success. And then you have the values that are less equal to or less than double the value, which is a partial or double up success. And by using these terms double up and double down, it's quicker to transfer information so that the game master can adjudicate what happens in the scene as every player fundamentally rolls for their action at the same time, so that there's fundamentally one or at most two die rolls in a game time sequence. I'm not going to go into the terms round or whatever, because it's not really the way they are represented in the game. Now, any die roll that is greater than the doubled up value or the DU value of any die roll is a failure. And that continues all the way up into abject failure, which is a failure of statistical significance, which means it's the last 5%. And then finally, the most catastrophic failure is to roll the dreaded double zero if you're using percentage dice. So the 100th percentile is just as horrible as the 0-1 is perfect. So now we talk about what we use these dice rolls for. Generally, you don't have to roll dice unless there's something action that causes a random effect that the die roll is representing. And so the idea of a basic skill check is important because you're determining the success failure of a particular skill that the player has employed in this particular round of action. And a basic skill check is a percentile dice check against the target value of the skill. And that is the character's equivalent base value for that. And therefore, if you roll that number or less than the double up value, you're going to get some level of success out of the die roll. A single check, you're simply checking against that number. It either succeeds or it fails. And in certain cases, the game master may authorize a partial success. The idea of, for example, having something that it needed to be moved, but you didn't successfully move it completely, but you did get a partial success. Well, you did get it to at least move some. So the idea here is that the skill check's value, the actual die roll's value, will determine the narrative for that particular skill. Now, I've recently had a conversation with a player about the actual merit of skills, and their theory was that skills are not really necessary because the mechanics of role-playing, in particular Dungeons and Dragons, already handles all of the mechanics that you need, and I strongly disagree. We'll go more into that as we move along. The next kind of skill checks are fundamentally the same, except for some reason it's done under duress or rushed circumstances, and therefore the odds of the success of that action are radically reduced, in which case we utilize the core value rather than the base value of the numerics in that case. And what this reflects really is just that it's much more difficult to do while you're under the stress of either having to do it in a hurry or having to do it while being interfered with. The way this would therefore play out is, let's say you were trying to unlock a door and you have a regular skill of, for example, picking locks of 25%. Well, if you are rolling against a normal skill, you just need to roll the fundamentally less than 50%, and your success would at least succeed partially. In the case of a rushed or pressured change, that number, instead of being a threshold of 25, becomes a threshold of 5, and so now your doubled up value is only 10. What this means is that it's much more difficult to accomplish, and if you do get a success level, it's because you rolled that much more in line with your attribute, and therefore have a chance of success. So what this means in game terms is that if you are going to try to accomplish something and it's under a rushed circumstance, it's much, much more difficult to accomplish. And so for players to really have to consider whether they want to waste the effort on that or perhaps do something that's more in keeping with the situation that they can accomplish more likelihood, in greater likelihood. Now, beyond the checks and the challenges, you also have the contests. And a contest generally is akin to, say, two people that are trying to do the same thing at the same time using the same skill target, and therefore it's a true contest. in which case they both roll and then compare against their numeric values to see what their relative success is, and you compare the relative success of one to the relative success of the other to determine which one is at least ahead for that round. And the concept is you continue to re-roll these contests until one succeeds and the other fails, or a certain number of successes have been accomplished to indicate that they've gone the distance, so to speak. Contests are fundamentally easy to accomplish, just like the others, in that you're simply looking at a skills numeric value and rolling against it for the relative success. The major upshot of the contest mechanism is that you could theoretically both accomplish the goal within the appropriate time or accomplish it at the same time, a photo finish, as you will, and therefore the relative conditions of the very last die roll will make the difference on whether or not one has won or the other has. Beyond that, we have something I've come to the term of counterpoint, and the idea here is that it's an action that one person takes to which there is a direct and opposite skill that the other player may pursue. For example, take the concept of hide and seek. One person is particularly good at hiding, and the other person has a particularly good skill at finding. And so therefore you each would roll against your particular skill, look for the relative value between the two. And whenever one has won and the other has lost, the contest ends. And in the meantime, you simply increase or decrease the amount of fatigue you're experiencing as you make your actions between the successes and the fails. And these are asymmetrical in that a person might have a particularly good skill at hiding, whereas the other may not be particularly apt at finding, and so therefore the odds of success or failure are in keeping with the actual attributes that the players have. And what this allows for is the opportunity to have conflicts that are not in direct combat, and there's not actually necessarily the use of martial skill. Of course, there's always the opportunity for combat, and there are some for whom the very idea of dueling or pitting one's skill against the other has a requirement to have some kind of danger involved. And the combat mechanism of Nykov's RPG is very much that, with the connotation that because it is so challenging to actually get to the point of lethality in a setting or a scene, that the very mechanics of the game lend themselves not to the ending of a life, but instead to coming to a clear winner versus loser situation. So the die rolling does use the same relative skills, but the the skill that one plays with can be either one that does lethal damage or chooses to invoke conditions on the battlefield, and therefore basically compete until there's clearly one success and one failure at the table within that fight. Now, even as I say that, I do want to make it clear that the concept of combat does not necessarily mean weapons versus weapons, or, as Fezzik would say, skill against skill alone. I can't help it if I'm bigger and stronger. Let's just see if we can kill each other with our bare hands. The idea of engagement, even in the combat realm, can be translated directly to other attributes. So, for example, you may determine that you wish to convince a player or a non-player engagement to consider a decision other than they've already had, and therefore you're rolling with your skill in verbal combat. And in the same fashion, you can get a partial or a wild success and actually convince the other person of your position, and by doing so perhaps get some advantage on the scene and progress the story. One of the major elements of this, therefore, is that your choice of mechanism determines which set of skills you're going to be employing to accomplish your victory. And by having this multiplicity of directions and a multiplicity of ways with which the engagement might go, really provides the game master and the players a broader range of what kind of scenes they want to play through. For example, the idea of one player searching for information from the other, but the other person is trying to hold back information. This skill versus skill challenge mechanism gives us the opportunity, even if we are doing it in a verbal combat, to utilize the attributes of the characters, for example, their intelligence, their brilliance, or even their cognizance, to determine whether or not they succumb to their opponent's condition and processes. I know that I sometimes overtalk the situation, but the reality here is that any conflict that you're going to go through uses a similar mechanism, one set of dice rolls, one set of mechanics, and covers the entire panoply of what might happen in a game session. So the purpose and the means by which a game master can direct the action is by presenting which argumental or which of the conflicts is most appropriate, and then the players determine their skill that would be appropriate. Then they roll against it, double check the contest values to see who's won, who's lost, and then resolves the scene. The game master is able to therefore direct not only the nuanced process of the player's skills being described, but also to provide the players with a input as to how the situation played out, giving it more visuality and more belonging, the sense of belonging that players do crave. And ultimately the utilization of the quantum mechanic, the idea of having multiple possibilities on each die roll, provides both the players and the game master with a dynamic means of transferring information to bring about a realistic experience in the play space, so that each person can feel the outcome of that condition through the dice rolls and the relative comparison. Ultimately, the biggest draw from this is that because you're using a similar mechanic regardless of which style of conflict you are dealing with, whether it be a social one or a political one or a physically demanding one, you're giving familiar and fun dynamics the opportunity to really answer the question of what happened in the scene, so that the players can walk away feeling like they are a part of what's going on and that the game is servicing what they are looking to present in terms of their abilities and skills in the game. I want to thank you for being here. I know I kind of ripped through this stuff pretty quickly, but as you may know, we are on air Monday through Friday, roughly at a 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time zones, and we provide these 5 days a week. So if there's any topics you'd like to have included that I haven't yet addressed, or if you want more information about how the Nikos RPG mechanism actually works, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll do what I can to get you back the information you're looking for as rapidly as I can. Until then, remember, I'm Jonathan Albin. This is the World of Nikos, and as my grandfather would say, go play.